Why you should never use CFTs, guys. So today we tested the F-15E on the dev server when it was opened to see if the CFTs are actually draining any performance from the aircraft, and to give you some options in loadouts for you to consider when you try to do them in the game. This can be considered for every F-15, since all the F-15Cs and Es and Is, all of the most modern ones, they do have the conformal fuel tanks. What are conformal fuel tanks? Well, it is those tanks, basically those tanks that are external to the aircraft on the side of the engines, but you cannot drop them. So it's a tank that if you take them, you cannot choose to drop them, which is a pretty significant difference from the external fuel tanks that we normally are accustomed, that you can drop them, okay? So how we did these tests are basically to minimize variables and to try to test how much performance these CFTs drain from the performance of the F-15 Eagle. In this case, Strike Eagle, okay? So the aircraft that we did the test on is the F-15E, okay? So we had three options over here, three subjects to the tests, to be trying to be as scientific as possible. I had a control group, or a control aircraft, and two test subjects. The control one was a fully empty F-15E, no external nothing, just internal fuel, fully filled, okay? The first subject was, that it's not a control, is the F-15E, nothing outside beyond CFTs, fully filled CFTs, and minimal fuel internally, okay? And the second test subject is using external fuel tanks and nothing else. So no conformal fuel tanks, but the external fuel tanks are there. Two external fuel tanks fully filled, plus 16 minutes of fuel internally. This means that all three subjects had a total flight time of fuel of 40 minutes, meaning that we can write off another variable here to properly test just the performance differences of choosing the external fuel tank or the CFTs or nothing in the aircraft, okay? So we're gonna basically just ignore the weapons, ignore everything else. We're just gonna focus, and even the weight of the actual fuel, you know, we're gonna ignore everything. We're just gonna see on the hardware itself of the aircraft, what is the difference in performance between an aircraft that doesn't have anything, an aircraft that uses CFTs, and an aircraft that uses external fuel tanks. And then we're gonna give a conclusion at the end. So let's go to the results, okay? We had 4 tests that we did, basically. One of them was for the total fuel wait time, the total weight of the aircraft itself, the optimal in thrust to weight ratio. So basically, when the engine is producing the most amount of power, how much thrust to weight you have on those situations. And then last but not least, the drag of the aircraft in basically force, right, at Mach 1. Okay, so the first one, total fuel weight of the aircraft. So here we see some minor differences. It's really hard to see, to like really, you know, fix this variable, but even with this, you will notice some conclusions that we can draw from it, right? So the control aircraft, the fully filled internally F-15E, had 6,103 kilograms of total fuel weight. The test 1, minimal fuel plus CFT test subject, had 6,147 kilograms. And the test subject 2, with 16 minutes of fuel plus the external fuel tanks, the 2 of them under the wings, had 6,006 kilograms of weight. So even though they change a little bit of the weight, you can see that the same amount of total like fuel time is basically the same, right? Which is kind of funny, but you will notice why later, okay? The next test was for total weight of the aircraft, and here we can start to see differences in performance. The control aircraft, the normal F-15E with just internal fuel tanks filled with up to 40 minutes, you know, so fully filled F-15E, nothing else, 21.1 tons of weight. The subject 1 with CFTs and minimal fuel had 22.27 tons, meaning that he had an increase of 1.17 tons just because he was using the CFTs. Even with the same amount of fuel, even with the same amount of time to fly, 40 minutes, barely, 40 kilograms of difference in weight of fuel here, you would still have 1.17 tons more. This is how bad the CFTs are for your aircraft, okay? And subject 2, with 16 minutes of fuel plus the 2 external fuel tanks, you had an extra weight of 0.2 tons compared to the full fuel, control group. So 21.3 tons, which means that the external fuel tanks are heavy by 200 kilograms, even though they have 100 kilogram less of fuel, which is kind of funny, right? So it is pretty heavy, but not as heavy as the CFT. The CFT is really, really heavy. And that makes sense, right? Because the CFTs and the external fuel tanks, they will increase weight because they are physical things. They're made of metal and stuff. So they need to have some form of weight, and they are implemented in the game. So for weight saving, the internal fuel tank is the best option out there, obviously, right? Then we go for the optimal conditioning thrust-to-weight ratio. So this is the most amount of power that I can manage to produce on these engines, flying with the 3 subjects, right? So we had a 1.35 thrust-to-weight in the control aircraft, internal fuel tank fully filled, 1.35. In the subject 1 with CFTs and minimal fuel, 1.27, a decrease of 0.08. So a pretty significant decrease since you are carrying the same weight. You're carrying literally the same weight in fuel. It's just the hardware that is doing the difference. And what is the hardware? Just the CFT. The CFT itself makes you lose 0.08 in thrust to weight. And it's subject to, in the external fuel tanks, it is 1.33, which is pretty good, 0.02 less than the control group with the internal fuel, right? So you can see that the external fuel tank, they do lose performance, but not as much as the CFTs. The CFTs, even though they're using the same weight in fuel, you have the same endurance of the aircraft, you still fly a lot worse. And then we go for the last test that we did, the drag, guys. The drag is basically the amount of force that it's going against the aircraft due to the air, the resistance of the air, right? This was tested at Mach 1 at all subjects, and it's kind of hard to do the really fine testing, but in a general sense, the control aircraft had a 12-ton drag, total drag of the aircraft. So full fuel tank internally, 12 tons. The aircraft subject 1 with the CFTs and minimal fuel had a 12.5, so an increase of 500 kilograms more or less of drag. And the subject 2 had more or less 500 as well. If you add another tank, it's another one. Like, it gets closer. This is more closer to 13 then, right? But yeah, with 2 tanks, it is 12.5. So they're very similar in the drag between the CFT and the external fuel tank. But at the end of the day, the full fuel internally is the least amount of drag. So what we can draw from this, the conclusion right now, is that if you take only the internal fuel tank and fully loaded with fuel, it means that you will be lighter, you will be less draggy, and have a way better thrust to weight. If you take the CFTs, you're not going to be able to get this extra weight out. You're gonna still have to maintain it even after you consume some of these fuels. So it doesn't matter what happens, this penalty in performance of 1.17 tons more and 0.08 less of a thrust to weight and 0.5 more drag will still remain even after you consume the fuel. So there is no reason whatsoever for you to use the CFT. It just increases by more than 1 ton, by more than half a ton in drag. It takes almost 0.1 of thrust weight of the aircraft just because you want to take the CFTs. So make sure that if you want to use the CFTs, it is because you want to use the CFTs because they brought something to you. What is actually bringing to you? Well, extra payload for you to do CAS. This is the idea for the F-15E and I. But for example, in the F-15C, there's no reason why to, because why would you want that, right? So yeah, CFTs only have one option, being used against air-to-ground targets for you to actually have a lot of bombs, a lot of missiles, a lot of everything, okay guys? If not, you're just taking more weight, less performance, less thrust to weight, more drag into your aircraft. There's no reason whatsoever for using CFTs, unless you want to just cruise along and fly for 2 hours in a match, right? And subject to the conclusion that we have here is that, of course, we do have a penalty of external fuel tanks, but it is way less than the CFTs. So if you want to take some form of external fuel tank, take the external fuel tanks themselves, not the CFTs. And of course, remember guys, although they do have a penalty in performance, the external fuel tank provides to you in a normal engagement one thing: possibilities of changing your weight by the moment's notice of clicking a button, which means that if you take, for example, the 16 minutes of fuel and 2 extra fuel tanks, you're gonna have the same endurance of the control aircraft. But if for some reason you need the performance to win a dogfight or anything like that, you can click one button, get these external fuel tanks out of your wings, and you are done. You are a very light aircraft and you can do it, right? So it's a little bit of a penalty to have that option, or not have a penalty and you have to take the full fuel load, even if you have an emergency situation that it would be nice to have less weight on the aircraft. Okay guys, these are the conclusions. Don't ever use your CFTs unless you're doing ground striking, and think about it. What would you use? A full fuel tank internally without the option to get some weight out of the aircraft, or having the option to just dump a lot of weight of the aircraft if needed to? Let me know in the comments, and let me know in the comments as well. Do you use CFTs? We will stop using it. Just remember, the F-15E, you will need to when doing CAS. But yeah guys, basically this is it. I hope you enjoyed. Make sure to subscribe. Let me know in the comments, as I said. And yeah, click the like button, subscribe, and bye guys. See you.